Gate C-14 at Ridgeview International Airport was already chaos. A weather delay out of Denver had backed up 3 flights at once, and the boarding line for Flight 2247 to Orlando stretched halfway to the food court. Gate agent Melissa Cho stood at her podium, scanning boarding passes as fast as her fingers could move, trying to keep the line moving and the tension down. Then she saw it. An empty airport wheelchair, the kind reserved for passengers with mobility needs, tagged and pre-assigned to an elderly man named Harold Bennett who had requested it weeks in advance, was being pushed toward the jet bridge by a woman in oversized sunglasses and a leopard print scarf, moving at a suspiciously brisk pace for someone who supposedly needed it. She wasn't pushing it for someone else. She was sitting in it. "Ma'am," Melissa called out, stepping around the podium. "Ma'am, that wheelchair is assigned to another passenger." The woman didn't stop. She simply raised one hand, phone in the other already recording, and said loudly enough for the entire gate area to hear. "I have a disability. I have every right to priority boarding. Are you discriminating against me right now? I will have your job." Behind her, an elderly man in a cardigan stood at the back of the boarding line, leaning heavily on a cane, quietly watching his reserved wheelchair roll away with someone else in it. Nobody in that gate area knew it yet, but this single, brazen act, stealing priority boarding from a man who genuinely needed it, was about to unravel into weeks of chaos, an airport-wide investigation, and a very public, very embarrassing reckoning that would end with this woman being legally required to prove, in front of witnesses, that she could walk just fine. This is that story. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, we cover true-to-life stories about entitled people who abuse rules meant to help others, and we follow the story all the way to its karma-filled conclusion. Today's story takes us to a busy international airport, where one HOA president's shameless attempt to skip a boarding line using a wheelchair that wasn't hers sets off a chain of events nobody saw coming: accusations, sabotage, hidden cameras, and finally, a public medical exam that exposes the truth once and for all. This one has twists you won't expect, so stick around till the end, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure you're subscribed because we've got plenty more where this came from. Let's get into it. Before the chaos, Ridgeview International was just a normal, mid-sized airport doing what airports do, moving people from one place to another, one boarding announcement at a time. Harold Bennett, 78 years old, had flown out of Ridgeview at least twice a year for the last decade, always to visit his daughter and grandchildren in Orlando. Harold had a bad hip from a car accident years earlier and used a cane for short distances, but for anything longer than 100 feet, especially the long walk from security to a far gate, he relied on the airport's wheelchair assistance program, which he always booked in advance through the airline's accessibility services line. He was polite, patient, and endlessly grateful to the gate agents and wheelchair attendants who helped him. He always tipped the attendants who pushed him to his gate, always thanked the flight crew by name, and always kept a small bag of butterscotch candies in his jacket pocket to hand out to airport staff for putting up with grumpy travelers like me, as he liked to joke. Melissa Cho, the gate agent working Flight 2247 that day, had checked Harold in for his flight dozens of times over the years. She recognized him instantly when he approached the counter that morning, cane in hand, boarding pass already out, chatting happily about seeing his granddaughter's dance recital. His reserved wheelchair had already been radioed for and was on its way to the gate. It should have been a simple, uneventful boarding process. It wasn't. Her name was Cheryl Danvers, and if you asked anyone in the Ridgeview Terrace Homeowners Association, they'd tell you 2 things about her. She had been HOA president for 9 years, and she believed, with total sincerity, that rules existed for everyone except her. Cheryl ran her HOA like a small kingdom. She fined neighbors for trash cans left out an hour too long. She once tried to force a family to repaint their entire house because their sage green shutters were, in her opinion, clearly more of a forest green, which violated the community's approved color palette. She had been the subject of no fewer than 3 petitions to remove her from the board, all of which mysteriously failed to gain traction, largely because Cheryl controlled the meeting schedule, the voting procedures, and conveniently misplaced any petition paperwork she didn't like. Cheryl also had a well-known reputation for treating public spaces the same way she treated her HOA, as things to be bent to her convenience. She was the woman who parked in expectant mother parking spots because she planned to have grandkids eventually. She was the woman who used a service animal vest on her chihuahua so she could bring it into restaurants, despite the dog having no training whatsoever. Rules, to Cheryl, were suggestions for other people. That day at Ridgeview International, Cheryl was flying to Orlando for a real estate conference, and she was running late, badly late, after spending 20 extra minutes arguing with a TSA agent about why her oversized carry-on didn't need to be checked. When she arrived at gate C14 and saw the long boarding line, and then saw an empty wheelchair sitting near the jet bridge with an attendant briefly stepping away to help another passenger, Cheryl didn't hesitate. She sat down, put on her sunglasses, and rolled herself straight toward priority boarding. "Ma'am, that wheelchair is assigned to another passenger," Melissa repeated, more firmly this time, stepping directly into Cheryl's path. "I have a legitimate disability," Cheryl snapped back, not even bothering to specify what it was. "You cannot ask me to prove it, that's illegal. I know my rights. I fly with anxiety and chronic fatigue, and if you delay me from boarding, that's discrimination, and I will be filing a formal complaint with corporate." Harold, standing quietly at the back of the line, spoke up gently. "Ma'am, I think that's actually my wheelchair. I called ahead for it." Cheryl didn't even look at him. "There are plenty of wheelchairs at this airport. This one is mine now." Melissa, trying to de-escalate a situation that was rapidly drawing stares from the entire gate area, radioed for a second wheelchair for Harold and asked her supervisor to come assist. But by the time backup arrived, Cheryl had already wheeled herself onto the jet bridge, boarded early, and settled into her seat, seat 14C, a completely standard economy seat with no accessibility accommodations whatsoever. Harold, using his cane and leaning on a second wheelchair attendant who arrived several minutes later, made it onto the plane just before doors closed, visibly shaken but too polite to make a scene. Melissa filed an incident report that afternoon, flagging the situation for the airport's customer service and accessibility compliance office. It should have ended there, a formal warning, maybe a stern letter. It did not end there. Because 2 weeks later, Cheryl was back at Ridgeview International. And this time, wheelchairs weren't the only thing that started disappearing. Over the following month, gate agents and accessibility staff at Ridgeview began noticing a disturbing pattern. Priority boarding wheelchairs, normally stationed in a designated holding area near each major gate cluster, started going missing at odd times, only to reappear later, sometimes with cushions slightly out of place, sometimes with the identification tags removed entirely. One elderly passenger, a woman flying to visit her son for his college graduation, arrived to find her pre-booked wheelchair simply gone, with no attendant nearby and no explanation. She missed her original boarding window and had to be rebooked on a later flight, sobbing quietly in customer service as staff scrambled to help her. A veteran with a prosthetic leg reported that his reserved mobility scooter, a piece of medical equipment specifically requested through the airline's Disability Services Department, had been borrowed without permission and returned with a dead battery, leaving him stranded near security for over 40 minutes. Staff initially assumed it was disorganization, maybe overworked wheelchair attendants misplacing equipment during especially busy travel days. But the pattern was too specific, too frequent, and always seemed to happen right around the time Cheryl Danvers was scheduled to fly, according to gate logs cross-referenced by an increasingly suspicious Melissa Cho. Melissa brought her observations to Ridgeview's accessibility compliance manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Rosa Delgado, who had spent over a decade advocating for passengers with disabilities and took equipment misuse extremely seriously. If someone is deliberately taking mobility equipment away from passengers who actually need it, Rosa said, that's not just rude. That's a federal ADA violation, and potentially fraud if she's falsely claiming a disability to skip lines. It was time to find out exactly what, and who, was behind it. Rosa worked with Ridgeview's security team to quietly install additional cameras near the wheelchair holding stations at 3 of the airport's busiest gate clusters, angles specifically chosen to capture anyone accessing the equipment without staff authorization. They also implemented a simple but effective new tracking system. Every wheelchair would now have a small, discrete numbered tag, cross-referenced against the passenger it was assigned to, logged the moment it left the holding area and the moment it was returned. Melissa, meanwhile, flagged Cheryl's name in the gate system, so that any future check-in or boarding attempt involving her would automatically alert accessibility staff. They didn't have to wait long. 3 weeks later, Cheryl checked in for another flight, this time to a conference in Atlanta, and once again requested priority seating due to disability at the gate counter, despite having no documented accessibility request on file with the airline. When she noticed a wheelchair sitting unattended near the holding station, tagged for a different passenger, she once again attempted to simply take it. This time, hidden cameras captured every second, Cheryl checking to make sure no staff were watching, removing the passenger identification tag from the wheelchair and tucking it into her purse, and rolling the chair away toward the gate, walking normally and briskly the entire time before finally sitting down just before reaching the boarding line. Rosa reviewed the footage the same evening, alongside 2 additional clips from previous weeks showing the same behavior pattern, Cheryl walking confidently through the terminal, checking her phone, browsing a duty-free shop without any mobility aid whatsoever, only needing a wheelchair the moment she was within sight of a boarding line. The evidence was clear, consistent, and damning. Rosa didn't act rashly. She knew that accusing a passenger of disability fraud without ironclad proof could backfire badly for the airport. So she compiled a full case file, the time-stamped footage, the missing equipment reports, the passenger complaints from Harold Bennett, the graduation-bound mother, and the veteran with the mobility scooter, along with the odd, repeated pattern of Cheryl walking normally right up until she needed to skip a line. She brought the file to airport administration and airline corporate security, who confirmed something important. Under both airline policy and federal transportation law, passengers requesting accessibility accommodations could, in cases of suspected fraud or repeated equipment misuse, be required to complete a basic mobility assessment before being granted continued priority services. A policy rarely enforced, but very much within their rights, especially given the volume of evidence collected. The plan was simple. The next time Cheryl attempted to claim a disability accommodation at Ridgeview International, she would be formally asked to undergo a brief medical mobility screening, conducted by an on-site airport medical provider, before being permitted to use accessibility services again. They didn't have to wait long for their next opportunity. 2 weeks later, Cheryl arrived at Ridgeview for yet another flight, and once again approached the gate counter, sunglasses on, already gesturing toward a nearby unattended wheelchair. This time, Rosa Delgado was waiting personally at the gate. "Ms. Danvers," Rosa said calmly, stepping forward before Cheryl could reach the wheelchair, "before we assign accessibility equipment today, we're going to need you to complete a brief mobility screening with our on-site medical provider." Cheryl froze for half a second before snapping back into character. "Excuse me. I already told you people I have a disability. This is harassment. We have documented reports and video footage showing repeated unauthorized use of mobility equipment assigned to other passengers," Rosa said, loud enough for the surrounding gate area to hear. "Given the pattern, airline policy allows us to request a basic screening before continuing to provide accommodations." A small crowd had already begun to gather, phones quietly rising. "This is discrimination," Cheryl shouted. "I will sue this entire airport." "You're welcome to decline," Rosa said evenly. "But then we won't be able to provide priority boarding or wheelchair services for this flight." Cheryl hesitated, clearly weighing her options, then, perhaps overconfident, perhaps unwilling to back down in front of an audience, agreed to the screening, insisting loudly, "Fine. I'll prove you wrong." The screening took place in a small, semi-private area near the gate, conducted by a licensed on-site medical provider, but with Rosa and 2 staff witnesses present, and, much to Cheryl's visible discomfort, clearly audible to at least a dozen nearby waiting passengers. The assessment was simple: basic mobility tasks, walking a short distance unaided, standing from a seated position without support, and a few brief health questions. Cheryl completed every task with ease. Quick, steady steps. No hesitation standing. No signs of pain, fatigue, or impairment of any kind. When the provider calmly announced, "Ms. Danvers shows no mobility impairment consistent with wheelchair accommodation needs," the surrounding crowd didn't hold back. "Are you kidding me?" one man muttered loudly. "I've been waiting 20 minutes because SHE was disabled." A woman nearby, who had watched Cheryl practically sprint through the terminal earlier that same day while talking on her phone, laughed out loud. "I saw her running to Starbucks an hour ago." Cheryl, red-faced and furious, grabbed her bag. "This is a witch hunt," she snapped, storming away from the gate, though notably, walking perfectly fine the entire time. Cheryl wasn't done. Within days, she filed a formal complaint against Ridgeview International, claiming discrimination and demanding Rosa Delgado be fired for humiliating a disabled passenger in public. She contacted a local news outlet, hoping to spin the story in her favor, framing herself as a victim of an overzealous airport staff member. At the same time, back home, Cheryl used her HOA position to retaliate against neighbors she suspected of gossiping about the airport incident, issuing petty fines, sending aggressive emails, and even attempting to have one neighbor's parking permit revoked after hearing they'd shared the story at a block party. She also, in a move that would later work spectacularly against her, posted an angry rant on the Ridgeview Terrace HOA community page, doubling down on her disability claims and accusing airport Karens of targeting her, not realizing that several neighbors, already frustrated with years of her selective rule enforcement, had begun quietly compiling their own complaints. But her media gamble backfired almost immediately. When the local news outlet reached out to Ridgeview International for comment, the airport's communications team provided the full documented case file, video footage, passenger complaint records, and the results of the voluntary medical screening Cheryl herself had agreed to. The story that ran wasn't the sympathetic piece Cheryl had hoped for. It was titled, "Local Woman Repeatedly Stole Airport Wheelchairs from Disabled Passengers, Failed Mobility Test." The fallout was swift. Ridgeview International formally banned Cheryl from receiving any accessibility accommodations without pre-approved medical documentation, the exact scrutiny she had tried, and failed, to avoid. Her airline, after reviewing the footage and formal complaints, suspended her frequent flyer account pending an internal fraud investigation, citing repeated misuse of accessibility services and unauthorized use of equipment assigned to other passengers. Even more damaging, Harold Bennett, the kind, patient man whose wheelchair had started this entire mess, was contacted by a local reporter for a follow-up story. Harold, gracious as ever, didn't ask for revenge. He simply said, "I just hope people who actually need help don't have to fight for it because of someone who didn't." That single quote struck a nerve online, and the story spread quickly, gaining far more traction than Cheryl's attempted smear campaign ever had. Back home, the HOA board, now armed with the airport case file, Cheryl's public meltdown, and a fresh batch of long-suppressed neighbor complaints, finally had enough momentum to hold a formal vote of no confidence. Cheryl Danvers, HOA president for 9 years, was removed from her position by unanimous vote, closing out the exact same week her accessibility privileges were suspended at the airport she'd spent months exploiting. The woman who had spent years pretending rules applied to everyone but her had finally been forced to prove, publicly and undeniably, that she never needed the exception in the first place. In the weeks that followed, Ridgeview International used the incident to strengthen its accessibility program. Rosa Delgado worked with airport leadership to implement a clearer, more consistent wheelchair tracking system across all terminals, ensuring passengers like Harold would never again lose their reserved equipment to someone simply taking advantage of a busy gate area. Melissa Cho, the gate agent who first noticed the issue, was recognized by airport leadership for her attentiveness and was later promoted to a lead customer service role. Harold Bennett, now something of a quiet local celebrity after the news story, continued flying to Orlando twice a year to visit his granddaughter, always greeted warmly by staff who remembered his kindness, and his butterscotch candies. Back in the Ridgeview Terrace neighborhood, residents elected a new HOA board, one that focused on genuine community concerns instead of petty rule enforcement. Several neighbors later admitted they'd long suspected Cheryl exaggerated situations to get her way but hadn't had the evidence, or the courage, to challenge her directly, until the airport story gave them exactly that. For Cheryl, the consequences lingered far longer than she expected. Her name remained tied to the story locally for months, and the mobility screening became something of a cautionary tale among frequent travelers. Accessibility accommodations exist for people who genuinely need them, and abusing that trust doesn't just hurt an airline's bottom line, it hurts the real passengers, like Harold, who depend on that system working properly. At its heart, this story isn't just about a stolen wheelchair or a viral news headline. It's about what happens when someone treats systems designed to help vulnerable people as tools for their own personal convenience. Cheryl Danvers didn't just inconvenience a handful of strangers. She actively took resources away from people who needed them, an elderly man with a bad hip, a veteran with a prosthetic leg, a mother trying not to miss her son's graduation. Every time she sat in a wheelchair she didn't need, someone who genuinely did was left waiting, stranded, or scrambling for help. The lesson here is simple, but important: accommodations exist because someone, somewhere, needs them to participate fully and fairly in everyday life. Exploiting that trust for a shorter line or a quicker boarding process isn't a clever shortcut, it's a betrayal of the very system meant to protect people who have no other option. Real fairness isn't about finding loopholes to skip the line. It's about making sure the person who actually needs the help gets it, every single time. So here's what I want to know from you: have you ever seen someone abuse accessibility services or priority accommodations just to skip a line or get special treatment? Did anyone ever call them out, or did they get away with it? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the stories you share are wild enough to become their own episode. If you enjoyed this one, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, fly safe, be kind to the people who actually need the help, and don't let the Karens skip the line.